Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And today I'm going to be talking with you about our neuroscience-informed approaches to anxiety and depression. So clearly we have an enormous problem that we are dealing with when we're talking about depression and anxiety. Looking at the latest World Health Organization statistics, we know that depression is affecting more than 320 million people worldwide, and that over 260 million people are currently living with anxiety disorders, which obviously are more chronic in presentation than depression. And of course, these afflict more women than men. And of particular concern is that these rates of anxiety and depression are escalating. So the estimates are an increase of 15 to 18% worldwide from 2005 to 2015. So we have an enormous need. Now, at the same time, we have developed some very highly effective treatments for anxiety and depression. Cognitive behavioral therapy, as you know, is the most widely empirically supported treatment for these conditions of anxiety and depression, and that's something that I think as a field we should be exceptionally proud of. But at the same time, there's an upper limit on the effectiveness. And the average statistic that you often see is that about 55% of those who complete treatment achieve what is called clinically significant improvement, not just a response, but a clinically significant response, where they're in the realm of remission, which means, unfortunately, that we have a long way to go. Now, with that in mind, a few years ago, Emily Holmes and myself and Anne Grabiel wrote a piece where we emphasized that one pathway, not necessarily the only, but one pathway by which we can enhance the response to treatment is to employ a much more mechanistic approach to treatment where we can understand the psychopathology and the engine that drives psychopathology. This, of course, requires, we think, that there be much more multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary work with scientists from different perspectives, all working together, all working on the same problem, whether it's animal scientists, cognitive scientists, neuroscientists, as well as, of course, the most important clinical scientists. When we have that kind of joint effort, that multidisciplinary approach, we have a much better chance of understanding the whole engine that drives psychopathology, not just the bits and pieces. And with that information in hand, the idea is that we can not only elucidate the mechanisms or the processes that underlie the engine of psychopathology, but that we can actually then hone our existing treatments and, of course, develop novel treatments based on ones that directly target those mechanisms or processes. So when I think of the processes or the mechanisms underlying psychopathology, I tend to draw from two basic motivational states, one being the appetitive motivational state, that's all about driving us towards approaching goals, approaching rewards. And then, of course, we have the defensive motivational state, which is all about helping us to avoid threats or punishments in our environment. Looking at those two emotional or motivational states, we've come quite some way in understanding the neurobiology, the behavior and psychophysiology, as well as the subjective and cognitive characteristics of those states. So summarizing across research, some from our own work, some from other people's work, we clearly know that the defensive system in the context of anxiety and depression is associated with elevations in threat circuitry, and I'll come back to some of the neurocircuitry as we move through. Clearly, patterns of avoidance behavior, autonomic readiness and reactivity to perceived threat, the endocrine response, elevated, and of course, at the level of subjective and cognitive functioning, we see estimates or evidence for negative judgments and perceptions. At the same time, and an area in which up until fairly recently we have not paid sufficient attention to, although I know that certain people, like Barney, is doing some more work in this area, is on the appetitive system. And that characteristic of depression and anxiety, alongside this elevated threat reactivity, we see deficits in the appetitive system to rewards, a weaker reward circuitry that may correlate with this overall motivational state, less approach to positive stimuli, less autonomic readiness and reactivity to positive stimuli or rewarding stimuli, and less positive judgments and perceptions about stimuli. Now, not only do we know that these features are correlates of anxiety and depression, but they also are predictive of the onset of anxiety and depression over the long haul. And so this is based on some of our work. We called it the Youth Emotion Project, where we selected individuals who were around 16 years of age and followed them for 9 years and conducted a series of psychophysiological, cognitive, behavioral, personality, and various other measures to look at what was a predictor of the onset of depression, anxiety in this group. And I'm going to show you just a couple of brief examples. So, for example, we've demonstrated that elevated cortisol upon wakening, so the cortisol awakening response is a measure of the stress hormone, is a pretty decent predictor of who develops depression over the next 3 to 4 years. It subsides as it over time in terms of its predictive value, but initially it's a pretty good predictor in people who are not previously depressed. And it's also a predictor of who develops social anxiety disorder over a period of 4 to 5 years. We've also shown that the eye blink startle reflex, which is a measure of the defensive response system, the psychophysiology of defensiveness, is a predictor of who develops anxiety disorders, not depression. So this is one that differentiates anxiety and depression. It's a predictor of who develops anxiety disorders over the next 4 years. And here, interestingly, it's the defensive response to what are called safe stimuli. These are conditions under which an aversive feature like a shock is not going to be given. But yet individuals who developed anxiety disorders showed an elevated startle reflex in the conditions when there should not be a shock. So it's an elevated response to safe stimuli in a broader context where shock did occur in what were called the danger phases over here. So another example of a predictive variable. And of course, we've also demonstrated that general autobiographical memory, the tendency to have vague or non-specific memories of past events in interaction with interpersonal stress, is a predictor of who develops depression. So these are just a couple of examples from our longitudinal study of processes or risk factors within the defensive motivational state. And what we're currently doing in what we call our brain mapped study is another longitudinal study where we take individuals who are 18 years old and follow them through to 22 years of age. And here the specific focus is not only on the psychophysiology and the behavior and the cognition, but also on the neural correlates of what predicts who develops depression and anxiety over the next 4 years. Another feature that we've worked on as a potential correlate of depression and anxiety, particularly anxiety disorders, which still fits within the defensive system, so I'm still talking about the defensive motivational state, is the whole extensive body of research on fear conditioning and extinction. And what I'm highlighting here is that individuals who are anxious show a pattern of deficit in the extinction of fear. And this is a critical characteristic because it means, essentially, that after a negative learning experience, these individuals hold on to that experience. They don't let it go. They don't update their memories based on a whole slew of subsequent experience which says the danger's gone. So even though they've had the experience of the danger no longer being present, they still hold on to the fear as if the danger had not gone away. And we refer to that as an extinction deficit. In this example here, these are control kids and anxious kids, and I won't go into the details other to show that the control kids acquire a fear of the stimulus that's paired with something aversive. That's that black bar here. During extinction, they lessen their fear response, measured using skin conductance. But look at the anxious kids. They hold on to their fear response. It does not decline at all. And in fact, 1 to 2 weeks later, it still hasn't declined. So this is an example of holding on to, failing to extinguish their fear response after an aversive event. And meta-analyses show that that tendency to retain the fear, not to extinguish it, which here is represented by this bar, is actually quite a strong effect size in differentiating anxiety and depression. The neurobiology that is associated with, and notice I use the term associated with, I'm never assuming neurobiology is the cause of everything, but it's an associated feature here, has been fairly well mapped out, so that during fear conditioning, you're often seeing activation within the amygdala, insular cortex, anterior cingulate cortex, and hippocampus. During extinction, it appears that much of the action is happening in the prefrontal cortical area called the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, which happens to have an inhibitory effect upon the amygdala. Okay? So this tends to downregulate the amygdala. And what we have found in anxious individuals, as much as their psychophysiology shows that they're not extinguishing, they're holding on to that fear response over time, similarly at the neural level, they're not showing that ventral medial prefrontal cortex activation which should be inhibiting the amygdala over time. So we're getting a nice combination there. And in fact, one of the goals of our new longitudinal study that I mentioned, the brain map study, is to look at whether that actually predicts who develops anxiety disorder, so that we would match not just the psychophysiology but the neural correlates of that deficit in ventral medial prefrontal cortex as a predictor of anxiety disorders. We know when we do treatments, so this is based on exposure-based treatments for anxiety disorders, we know that we actually end up finding more connectivity between the ventral medial prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. So if you look down here at this slide, it's showing that the greater the connectivity between the ventral medial prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, the better the treatment response. So those who get that connectivity going are showing a better response. So we know our existing treatments are having the desired effect at a neural level. But I want to bring us back to the question of what I'm arguing for this presentation is that we need to develop novel treatments that even more directly target things like how do you get people to extinguish? How do you get them to let go of that fear? How do we get that ventral medial prefrontal cortex doing what it's supposed to be doing and inhibit the amygdala? I'm not going to go through this entire slide, but these are some of the methods that we have been using over the years to try to do that, to try to hone and develop new treatments to enhance that extinction mechanism, that letting go of fear through the course of exposure therapy. And what I'm going to focus on right now is this bottom right-hand section here called context attenuation, because that's our latest data. These are data that are still hot off the press, so to speak. Well, actually, they're still in the press. They're not off the press yet. So I'm going to come back to this slide again. Just bear with me a little bit here. So remember I said the ventral medial prefrontal cortex has been really strongly implicated in the extinction of fear. It appears to relate to the inhibition of the amygdala. Okay. There's another element that's really critical, and that's the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is central to what is called context specificity of extinction. Now let's translate that for a minute to exposure therapy. What that means is, as people go through exposure therapy, which I think of as a clinical proxy of extinction, as people go through exposure therapy, the learning tends to get tied to the context in which the exposure takes place. So if I do exposure to public speaking in this context, my learning tends to get tied to this context, such that if I now go out and do a public speaking task at a totally different environment or a totally different context, such as at a wedding, whatever I learned here is not going to generalize as readily to that new context. And the mechanism or the correlate of that seems to be the hippocampus. Because the hippocampus is that region that is responsible for temporal spatial encoding of learning of emotional events. Okay? So that led animal researchers in my department to hypothesize, not that one, this one. If we could interfere with the hippocampus, if we could somehow downregulate the hippocampus, as animals are going through extinction, that means whatever they learn during extinction should generalize to other contexts, because you no longer have that region that seems to be so responsible or connected to tying it to a given context. You with me? And the way they have done that, there are a number of ways. You could lesion the hippocampus and you get those effects. We're not going to lesion hippocampi. But they've also demonstrated that pharmacologically there is an agent called scopolamine. Some of you may have heard of this. This is a drug that's often used for motion sickness. It's a cholinergic antagonist that actually temporarily interrupts cholinergic transmission within the hippocampus. So essentially, in a very crude way, it downregulates the hippocampus. And as you can see from this is work from Mike Fanzelo in my department, rodents, yes, rodents, but in rodents, if they're given saline, the control group, if they don't go through exposure or extinction, and then they're tested in the same context in which extinction took place, this is the level of fear that you see right here. But if they're tested in a brand new context, you see fear returns. That's the phenomenon I've been talking about, context renewal. Fear enhances when you go to a brand new context. But when you give scopolamine, these rodents don't show the renewal of fear, right? So the learning that's happened during extinction is no longer tied to the context. It generalizes to other contexts. So we said, let's do that in humans. Let's give humans scopolamine as they go through exposure therapy to see if we can reduce the context renewal. That in other words, the learning that happens will spread to other contexts. And so that's what we've done. And we did it all with virtual reality. So we took individuals who had social anxiety disorder and had public speaking anxiety. And we randomized them to different dosages. One was a placebo, one was a 0.5 milligram of scopolamine, one was a 0.6 milligram of scopolamine. Now, scopolamine does nothing to fear levels. It doesn't change how much fear you experience. It just affects the hippocampus in terms of whether it's activated as much as it could be or not during exposure therapy, all right? And so what we did is we took individuals, as I said, with social anxiety disorder. I put this here on the left because we don't know what context they acquired their fear, but we randomized them to these 3 conditions, and then they went through exposure therapy in virtual reality. We did that because it's easy to manipulate. They had 7 sessions twice a week, and each time they gave 7 speeches. So it was 49 speeches total. And then we tested them. So they went through exposure in this kind of virtual reality context, and then we tested them in the same virtual reality context versus a different virtual reality context. Of course, they did not have the drug when we did the testing. And the assumption is that if scopolamine's working, you should see less fear in the groups with scopolamine when they went into the brand new context, right? And so what we found is, first of all, we just tested, does this virtual reality exposure work? And this is just giving a speech in front of a live audience before and after going through virtual reality exposure. And here we're not expecting any differences across the 3 groups because it's all in the same context of being in front of an audience. And you can see that their fear level significantly reduced to the same degree from before to after those 7 sessions of virtual reality exposure. So it's an effective treatment overall. But here's the critical test. What happens when we test them in the new virtual reality context versus the same virtual reality context? And here we get, this is now a measure of fear arousals, orienting fear arousal from psychophysiology. And you can see the placebo group is showing significantly higher fear in the new virtual reality context than the 2 scopolamine groups. They didn't differ when they were tested in the same context as the context in which they went through exposure therapy. So this is a sign that scopolamine essentially prevented the renewal of contextual fear. Or another way to say it is fear learning during exposure generalized more in the scopolamine groups. And another test is called emission fear arousal. It's another psychophysiological measure. And again, we got the same effects. That the placebo group showed a much higher fear in the new virtual reality context. So they showed context renewal, whereas our 2 scopolamine groups did not show that renewal of fear. They were less fearful. We also wanted to make sure, well, is this working through the mechanism that we think it should be working? So we used a task called the mnemonic similarity task, which is a test of hippocampal functioning. It's all about pattern separation. Basically, you're given a set of items, you're asked to encode them by just saying, are these indoor or outdoor items over here on the left? And then you're tested, and you're shown a set of items, some of which are completely new, novel foils that didn't exist before, like the duck, some of which are exact repetitions, and some of them are similar but not exactly the same, like the seahorse. And if scopolamine's working, you should see more errors in the similar lures and the novel foils than the placebo, because hippocampal functioning is centrally involved in pattern separation. And we did. So those who had placebo showed fewer errors in describing a similar item as an old one, a novel item as an old one, or a novel item as a similar item. And they were more accurate, the placebo was more accurate in saying a similar was similar. Does that make sense? So in actuality, the scopolamine did what it was supposed to do at the hippocampal level. So we have some confidence that this is doing something to the hippocampus. And we had no adverse effects from scopolamine. So this could be an agent that can be easily implemented as people go through exposure therapy to enhance the generalization of their fear as they go into new contexts. Because we want the learning through exposure therapy to spread. We don't want it to be tied just to one context. Now let's flip that for a second. As much as we want exposure therapy to spread, when people first acquire fear, we would really like it to be contained, right? We would really like that fear to be limited to the context in which the fear happened. But unfortunately, when we are traumatized, our hippocampal functioning is impaired at that moment. The impairment of hippocampal functioning, and it has to do with high levels of cortisol that are expressed at the moment we're traumatized. The impairment of hippocampal functioning, think of it, means that fear spreads, right? Because if the hippocampus is not online, fear is going to spread. Just like when exposure therapy, if the hippocampus is not online, learning is going to spread, extinction learning. Here, fear learning will spread. So as much as we want to as much as we want to impair hippocampal functioning during exposure, we would really like to enhance hippocampal functioning just after being traumatized so that the fear does not spread. You with me? It's like the exact opposite. And in fact, that's been demonstrated in rodents. That by enhancing hippocampal functioning as rodents go through traumatization, which means they get shocked, you see less generalization of fear. And it's done through glucose. Glucose, simple glucose. And so we've done an experimental study with humans. And this is a laboratory study. And we basically taught or helped. We shocked these participants. I was trying to think of the right word. We shocked these participants. And so they acquired a fear. And then we gave them either glucose or placebo. And as you can see, what we found that when they were shocked as they went through acquisition, we then tested them afterwards, and those who had glucose developed a much stronger fear of the condition, the context in which they were shocked, and a much less fear of the condition in which they were not shocked. Whereas the placebo group, it wasn't equally discriminated. So we're thinking glucose, simple glucose, could actually help prevent the spread of fear after being traumatized, and it's now being tested in emergency rooms. So we're now testing this out, and actually I should say it's Tom Miner's group, who was the animal researcher, testing that out in emergency rooms because it has to be right within the 6-hour window of traumatization as a way of potentially offsetting the spread of fear, meaning less likely to develop PTSD. Now, I want to focus on one other area related to the defensive system, and it has to do with attention. Attention is critical to learning. So as people go through exposure therapy, how you attend is really important. I don't think we pay enough attention to attention. I was in the workshop the other day, I was laughing because I always think Colin Farrell has a beautiful, attentive face. He's just really attending, and so that's why I've got him up there. We know from our own experimental work that if people are good at attending up front, if they're attenders, they do better with exposure therapy. Because you know anxious people, some are attenders and some are avoiders. People who are attenders actually do better with exposure therapy. So this was a study we had done where you can see that the green bar are people who are responders at the big baseline, and those who are responders at these are people who are responders, but at baseline, if they showed elevated delay in disengaging from threat, so they stayed with the threat stimulus. It took them a long time to move their attention away from the threat stimulus using a dot probe kind of task. Those ones were much more likely to be responders than non-responders. So attention to threat predicts good response. We've replicated that. And we've also replicated at a neural level. So in the scanner, in the fMRI scanner, we show images of rejection. These are video clips where somebody is showing a negative facial expression and said, "Nobody likes you." And this is a neutral clip. This is a big house. They go through a whole series of these over and over again. And then we tested how well people responded to exposure therapy. And those who had the largest amygdala response to the reject images relative to the neutral images. And the amygdala response, as much as it's involved in fear acquisition, it's also involved in attention to threat. So it's a big marker of attention to threat. So those who had the biggest amygdala response did the best with exposure therapy over time. So we've got this knowledge that attention to threat actually predicts better outcome. It's a little hard to manipulate threat as people go through exposure therapy. We can tell them, right, just pay attention, but it's a bit hard to actually, how do you know they're paying attention? So there's another body of research which has helped us in this regard in a strange way, and it's called inhibitory regulation through affect labeling. So affect labeling is essentially you're presented, this is the standard paradigm for affect labeling, you're presented emotional images like this negative, scared face, and you're asked to label what is the emotion that matches that face. By being asked to label it, you have to attend, right? So it's a nice manipulation in a way of attention. It also does a bunch of other things. These are all the comparison conditions. And what you typically find at a neural level, just so you know, is that when people attend by affect labeling, what's neurally going on is the right ventral lateral prefrontal cortex, another area of the prefrontal cortex, becomes activated, and it tends to downregulate the amygdala. If you do this over and over and over again, this affect labeling, you're eventually seeing a downregulation of the amygdala. Here in these healthy controls, you're seeing that expected downregulation of the amygdala when going through affect labeling compared to one of the control conditions. Unfortunately, in our anxious groups, this is socially anxious comorbid with other anxiety disorders, and this is socially anxious comorbid with depression. Even though their right ventral lateral prefrontal cortex was activated, they were not getting down regulation of the amygdala. In fact, you're getting up regulation of the amygdala. So there's some disconnect going on. So we started a series of studies saying, okay, affect labeling becomes a way of helping people to attend to the stimulus as they go through exposure therapy, but people with anxiety disorders, particularly if they've got comorbid depression, seem to have some deficits in that area. They're not getting the benefits of affect labeling. So let's try to build it up as much as we can repeatedly throughout exposure therapy. And so we've done a series of studies where we have people go through affect labeling at the moment they're doing exposure. And this is the first study that we had done, or actually the second study we had done. It was spider-phobic individuals. And as they went through live exposure, in vivo exposure to a live spider, in the labeling group, they would simply come up with things like sitting in front of the ugly spider, that's the label, makes me feel very nervous. So they're also labeling their emotional response. And they would come up with different phrases over and over and over again. The reappraisal group, which is more like traditional cognitive therapy, sitting in front of the little spider's not that dangerous for me. Distraction and exposure alone. Those who went through the affect labeling, we then tested them 1 week later with a brand new spider in a brand new context. So this is from the end of treatment to 1 week later. Look at the affect labeling group. Too many things at one time. Look at the affect labeling group. Their skin conductance decreased from the end of exposure to 1 week later, relative to every other group. And they were more willing to get closer to and pick up the live spider, the brand new tarantula, relative to the other 3 groups. And we then did Pennebaker's analysis of the content of what they said as they went through affect labeling. The more times they said, I feel nervous, I feel afraid, I feel scared, the better they were doing 1 week later, which is amazing to me. So it's the opposite of cognitive restructuring. It's the acceptance of emotions. So that's a whole nother discussion, but there you go. We've replicated that largely with public speaking anxiety. We now have a pilot study with PTSD. So we've taken combat vets, primarily the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, and we did simply repeated sessions of affect labeling. So they were shown combat images like this. And what was fascinating, actually, we got this image from a large image base. Some of the, well, this was probably a confound, but some of the subjects knew the pictures. They had seen those, they had actually been there. But anyway, the combat images were shown for 30 seconds, and they came up with affect labeling. I feel sad, angry, or other. Not how they felt at the time, but as they viewed the images, right? We did that for 6 sessions over 3 weeks. That's all we did. That's it. 30-second images repeated for about 20 minutes at a time. First of all, we compared the PTSD group at baseline to a group that had been equally traumatized but did not have PTSD. And you can see that, as you might expect, those with PTSD in the scanner, when they looked at other combat images, not the ones we trained them on, but when they looked at other combat images, they have a stronger amygdala response than the healthy controls who were traumatized but did not have PTSD. Now, this is a small pilot study. We then treated the PTSD using that affect labeling. So it's a small pilot study of 12. Just by going through that, 42% no longer had PTSD, using independent, blind clinician ratings. And their amygdala reactivity to the images in the scanner decreased from pre to post, and the amount of decrease correlated strongly with their reduction in symptoms. So this is an area that we're following up on moving forward. It's a totally different way of thinking about how to do treatment for PTSD. On top of all of this is the last thing I'm going to say about the defensive system. Everything I've said, forget. Because now we have this other thing we're thinking about, which is unconscious fear extinction. So working with Hak-Wan Lau, we now have a grant to study, can you do extinction without the person knowing what they're extinguishing to? Meaning for people who are so fearful of doing exposure therapy that they refuse it. They won't even look at the phobic stimulus. Here, we have a methodology where we can present the phobic stimulus in a masked form and at the same time have the individual match the neural signature of a non-phobic individual. And our pilot work has shown that when tested subsequently to the actual phobic stimulus that they can see, they show much less fear. Go figure. So unconscious fear extinction. This is another example of a neuroscience-informed treatment. I'm going to now move to the appetitive system, the one that motivates approach towards goals and rewards. And as I said before, we already have pretty good data looking at the correlates of this appetitive system that's been ignored and should be emphasized more in depression and anxiety. We've been doing lots of studies looking at this appetitive system both across the psychophysiology, the behavior, and the neural signatures. A good task that we've been using is the monetary incentive delay task. And the neural signatures that seem to be most correlated with the appetitive system, the reward system, is in the ventral striatum, and particularly the nucleus accumbens, the right and left nucleus accumbens. This is a study we have going on with about 200 participants who are depressed and anxious across UCLA and UCSD, and you can see that in this game they lose money or they win money. It's like a gambling task. And as you can see, as they win money, you get much more activation, both left and right, or right and left, in the nucleus accumbens. We're interested particularly in the appetitive system because it's just as much as the defensive system predicts the onset of depression, anxiety, deficits in the appetitive system predict depression and anxiety. It's not just depression. We used to think it was just depression, but it's also anxiety. This is from our Youth Emotion Project, and you can see that low levels of positive emotionality are predictive of the onset of depression, social anxiety disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and trending for the other anxiety disorders. It's complex because it interacts with the negative defensive system, but there's something there to say it's a predictor. And as many of you know, low levels of appetitive system responding predict poor response to treatment. And up until fairly recently, existing treatments have had pretty limited effects on the appetitive system, meaning our existing CBT treatments have done well with reducing the negatives, the negative defensive system, but have not done very well at raising the positive appetitive system. And so we raised the question for ourselves, how can we do that? How can we raise the positive system, particularly in individuals with deficits in appetitive responding? So we drew heavily from neuroscience. So again, a neuroscience-informed approach, which has tended to identify different neural signatures associated with these three components of the appetitive system: the anticipation or motivation system, the what's called attainment system. So the anticipation or motivation is waiting for and looking forward to and being willing to work for a reward. The attainment system is how do you react when you get a reward? That savoring experience, that feeling of this feels good. And the learning is how do you learn that if I do this, I get a reward? There are lots of other components to this system, but they are the three that we emphasized based on our review of the literature. And so we developed something called positive affect treatment. And the positive affect treatment tries to target these three elements, the motivation, the attainment, and the learning. And the first is what is called behavioral training with specificity recounting. So it looks like behavioral activation to start off with, but an enormous part, and the majority of it, is specificity training for the memory of what they did. So we would take people out, have them do a positive event, like typical behavioral activation therapy, but the key of the treatment is when they come back in, we spend about 30 to 40 minutes of the session going through moment to moment the experience of what they did, having them zero in on that moment when they felt most positive, and recounting what they thought, what they felt, what they were doing, like a specificity training around that positive experience. And we call it a savoring with specificity training. I think it overlaps with the work that, probably the work that Barney Dunn is doing, and probably the work that Tim Daglish is doing with specificity training. We then, this is a multi-component treatment yet to be pulled apart. Our second, and so the behavioural training is 7 sessions. The next part is cognitive training. We do cognitive training to identify positive features. So it's a bit like attentional training to the positive. So within complex arrays of stimuli, identify the positive feature. We do imagining positive outcomes using Emily Holmes's imagery training. So positive training to images over and over again. And we do attribution training to identify features or ways in which the self contributed to a positive outcome. And then, just to throw it all in the kitchen sink, we have the final section of compassion training, which is really a combination of loving kindness, gratitude, generosity, and appreciative joy. And this is a 15-session treatment. So we take people who are depressed or anxious and are functionally impaired. We randomly assign them to this positive affect treatment or to what we're calling negative affect treatment, which is more like what we think of as CBT. But it's all, positive affect treatment is all about how do you raise positive emotions. Negative affect is how do you reduce negative emotions, and we assess them throughout and at post and at follow-up. This is currently in review. This is changes in positive affect. So, I'm trying to get the right thing here. Right, so this is the positive affect treatment, and look at this change in positive affect. And it's linear. It increases across the entire treatment. Now, of course, we don't know if that's just a carryover from here, or it's because we do the cognitive work, or we do the compassion training, but it continues to increase, and this top line here is normative levels. So we're approaching normative levels of positive affect, which we haven't seen before in our other work, and much more so than negative affect treatment. Somewhat surprisingly, it's also better at reducing negative affect. It's also better at reducing depression. It's also better at reducing stress. And stress here is from the Lovabond depression, stress and anxiety scale, so it's sort of a measure of the physiological aspects of anxiety. Or the cognitive, I forget which one. We're now doing this in virtual reality. Again, I've become a fan of virtual reality because it gives experimental control with neuroimaging. So we're looking at, does this training actually change that ventral striatum nucleus accumbens throughout the course of treatment? And we're also doing it in a mobile form, so it's not dependent on coming into our clinic. So I'm going to finish up with what Heather mentioned, which is the Depression Grand Challenge. So the Depression Grand Challenge is a neuroscience-informed approach. It's a study we've taken on at UCLA as one of two initiatives. One is a sustainable environment, and the other is how do we deal with depression as the leading burden of disease across the world. Currently, leading disability estimated to be the leading cause of global burden of disease by 2030. So we have this ridiculous mission. Reduce the burden of depression by 50% by the year 2050 and eliminate it by the end of the century. So I'm holding on. 72 more years, okay. But it's an interdisciplinary endeavour. It has four main components to it. At the centre is a 100,000 person study. So recruiting 100,000 individuals in order to evaluate the causes of depression from both a genetic standpoint, the primary director. There are four of us who are leading this endeavour, and the primary director is a geneticist, along with Jonathan Flint. So it's Nelson Freimer and Jonathan Flint, myself and Larry Zabursky, who's a biochemist. And so looking at the genetic, but as well as the environmental and psychological factors that contribute to the onset of depression and anxiety. That's being matched with a discovery neuroscience component, where we're looking at elements associated with the cognitive and neural functioning, as well as all of our other typical measures, and all of that leads into treatment. So how can we use this information to develop better, more focused, more targeted treatments? And we also have an awareness and hope component. In the 100K study, as you can see, we're measuring everything we possibly can, from genetics to neurocognitive, as I said, biological sampling, patient self-report, clinical, electronic, and a big part of what we're doing, which I think is happening a lot in the UK as well, is digital monitoring from cell phones. And then the overall goal is that we're screening 2 million patients from the UCLA healthcare system to get our 100K, to take them through this cycle. We're also right now targeting the UCLA student body, which is 45,000, in order to provide a scalable model of treatment. So I want to thank you for your attention, and hopefully this gave you a glimpse into the kind of work we're doing into neuroscience-informed treatments. Thank you very much.
Okay, really inspiring talk from Michelle. I think we have time for maybe one question.
Hi. I just wanted to go back to what you said about glucose. I don't know if this is switching on. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
When somebody has a shock, it's traditional to give them something sweet to help them to deal with the shock. And I wondered if you've got anything to say about that.
In the, which study are you talking about?
No, I'm not talking about a study. I'm talking about folk wisdom, that when somebody's had a shock,
yes.
give them something sweet.
Yes.
To help them to deal with it. I just wondered what you had to
Yes,
say about
can everybody hear that? Yeah. So giving, when people have a shock, not in the States for some reason. Sweet tea. Yeah. Australia, yes. The UK, maybe it sounds like too. It may be this very same mechanism. Maybe it was a folklore that developed with a recognition that it had an impact. I'm not sure. But that's the idea, that when really traumatized, the cortisol levels go so high that they actually have this sort of counteractive effect with glucose levels in the body. And the reduction in glucose is quite dramatic, and it actually deprives the hippocampus, which is very sensitive to glucose levels, which we believe is one of the reasons why the fear spreads. So, I think keep doing what you're doing. Are the rates of PTSD here lower, is the question.
Diabetes is very high, though.
Diabetes is very high. Too much sugar. Okay.
Great. Well, thank you again. And if anyone has any questions, do feel free to come up.